Hello everyone and welcome back to Miss Key's Classroom. My name is Rachel and my goodness, it has been a long time since I've sat down to film a video. Term 2 was absolutely crazy for me. I felt like I didn't stop and like I was definitely crawling to the finish line in week 10. But it's school holidays now, so I finally got some time to film a video. And on my Instagram stories the other day, I asked for some suggestions and a couple of people asked for a video all about differentiation. And so that is what I'm going to talk about today. Differentiation is one of those topics that they harp on about at uni, and that is a really important, skill to be able to do, to be able to differentiate your teaching. But often it is a lot easier said than done. So today I'll be talking you through how I differentiate and maybe giving you some tips of how you can do it in your classroom as well. So let's get straight into the video. Alright, so let's start off by talking about what differentiation actually is, because like I mentioned before, we're taught about it at uni, and then when we go out teaching, there's a really big focus on differentiation, but I guess it's important to get back to what the actual point of it is. And so I think that differentiation, the idea behind it, is that you change, you modify, you adapt things so that all students have the best chance at success. And I guess there's a common misconception as well that differentiation is just for students who are struggling or who maybe have a learning difficulty or something like that. But differentiation is also for students who you need to stretch as well. So maybe you've got a student who is doing amazingly well in every single assignment and it's not very difficult for them, they're sort of just cruising through. Well, it's important to differentiate for them as well, because you want to stretch them. You want all students to be challenged. And so I think differentiation is all about making sure that students are given the best chance to push themselves and to succeed, whether that be in a particular task or assignment that you're doing, or maybe it just be in a little lesson activity that you're doing. So I think there are so many opportunities to differentiate your teaching, and I think there's also a common misconception that differentiation involves writing 5 different assignments for 5 different students or something like that. But I guess in today's video, I want to talk about how I differentiate, and hopefully you'll be able to see that it doesn't always involve reinventing the wheel for each student and changing absolutely everything. It's more about changing little things or giving options to students so that everyone has an opportunity to succeed and everyone can demonstrate the learning or the skill that you want them to be able to by completing that activity or that assignment. So the first way that I differentiate in my classes, both when I am just teaching a lesson, so with lesson activities, but also with assignments, is by giving students options. And I think this is probably the easiest way to differentiate, because it sort of builds in differentiation into what you're teaching, rather than, like I said before, where you have to write multiple different assignments or something like that. So giving students choice allows them to have a bit of ownership over their learning. So maybe when you are completing an assignment, and maybe it's an essay, and so you give students choices for what essay question they respond to. And they might all be looking at exactly the same text, but the questions that they are responding to might be different. And so that's one really easy way to differentiate, because a student can choose something that is maybe going to challenge them, or maybe the one that they are most interested in. And so I think that in doing that, you'll be able to see any student that is sort of struggling might choose a particular question that's perhaps a little bit easier, and that will give them the best chance to succeed. But then again, another student who is maybe flying through your class might choose maybe a little bit more difficult question to sort of stretch them a little bit more. So I think giving options is a really important thing to do, and I try and build that into every single lesson. So that's an example of doing it with an assignment, but maybe in a lesson, you might be able to build in options as well. And so in my Year 8 class, my Year 8s love doing Choose Your Own Adventure. And that's where I give them various options of what they can do in that lesson. And so by doing that, by giving a choose your own adventure, where I've got various activities which all help to develop the same skills, the students can choose the ones that interest them, and it still makes sure that all the students are getting the same learning. So maybe one way I do that would be in history. if we were looking at medieval Europe or something like that, if I was doing a choose your own adventure for a lesson and we were maybe looking at medieval life, let's say, I would give various different options of how the students could investigate medieval life. So maybe it's that they have to research and then make a PowerPoint. Maybe it's that they have to write a diary entry pretending to be a peasant and explaining what life is like as a peasant. Or maybe they can create a little how to live as a peasant guide or something like that for someone else. And so building in those options within lesson activities, which all require students to develop the same skills. So with that example, the medieval Europe one, all students would have to research. Regardless of what option they would have chose, they all would have had to do some research. And so that's really the skill that I want them to learn in that. But then the way they demonstrate their learning is completely up to them. And so my number one tip with differentiation is build in those options into your lessons, into your assignments, because it will save you having to create whole different activities or whole different assignments for students, because giving a student choice allows them to say, okay, I'm going to choose this one because this is the one I'm interested in, or this is the one that I'm going to find easiest. I'm going to be able to succeed if I choose this option. So I hope you can see that giving options to students is very beneficial, and I'd highly recommend building them into your lessons or your assessment tasks if you don't already. So the next thing that helps me differentiate is scaffolding. And I can remember when I first heard this word at uni and I thought, what on earth are they talking about? Providing scaffolding. I didn't understand what that meant, and I didn't understand how it applied to teaching as well. But then when I got onto my teaching placements, and I sort of went through it with my mentor teacher, I could really see the benefit of scaffolding. So I guess I like to think of scaffolding as providing students with help in order to achieve a certain goal or learn a certain skill. So there's various different ways that I scaffold assignments, and I just want to preface all this by saying that getting scaffolding right can be really hard. Sometimes it's very easy to over scaffold and provide students with too much help, but it can also be very easy to under scaffold, and so students are sort of like floating around wondering what on earth they're meant to be doing because the scaffolding's not clear or something like that. So I just wanted to make a note of that, I guess, before I talk about it anymore, because I certainly don't always get scaffolding right and it can be really tricky, but I think it is a really important tool when you are differentiating. So the first type of scaffolding that I like to provide students with are examples of what I want to see with their assignment. So maybe they are writing an essay again, so I'd provide them with a paragraph example. Maybe they are writing a narrative, so I'd provide them with a narrative example. So giving students examples shows them what they're meant to be producing. I've found that sometimes I've got a really clear idea in my head of what I want students to produce, and if I don't provide them an example of that, sometimes they end up creating something completely different than what I was expecting. And so I like to provide students examples, and maybe the example might not even be exactly what they're doing. So if they're writing a paragraph, I might not provide them an example of a paragraph about the same topic that they're writing about. It might be a different topic, but I think that that helps them to see what they're actually meant to be aiming towards. So providing examples is one way that I scaffold. And then another type of scaffolding, which sort of goes hand in hand with examples, is providing templates or providing sort of planning sheets that match up with the examples. So often in an example, I'll color code it in some way. So if it's a narrative, I'll color code the exposition, the complication, and the resolution. And then I'll have a planning document on which students can write out their narrative plan. And I'll have different boxes, one for exposition, one for complication, one for resolution, and they will be colored in the same colors that I used on the example. And so I find that that helps students to be able to see the relationship between what they're planning and then what they'll actually end up producing. And so color coding is, I think, a really effective way, especially if it relates to something else. So I color code on the example and then on the template or on the planner that I give them as well. So they're sort of the two main ways that I scaffold. So giving examples and then giving some sort of planning as well. But there are various other things that you can do as well. So you can sort of do a step-by-step guide or something like that students can follow through. I tend to do that for more complex tasks or maybe tasks that have multiple sections. I'll do a sort of like step-by-step and we'll go through different steps each lesson. But I think another important thing to note is that scaffolding doesn't have to look the same for every student. And so if I go back to the example of paragraph writing, and maybe I want students to write a really nice, neat teal paragraph. Some students might find that very challenging and it might not be accessible for them. They might not be able to do that. And so what I'll do in order to scaffold a little bit more is I'll provide them with a question and answer sheet. And so they'll answer the questions and I'll say how many sentences they need to write for each question. And then I'll work with that student in order to put it into a paragraph. So it's sort of like paring it back even more. And so I guess it's not essential to do that for every student because a lot of them will just be able to write a paragraph based on the other scaffolding that I've given them, the example and the planning sheet. But for some it might be too challenging. And so breaking it down even further can really help them. So I guess it all comes down to knowing your students and how much help they need. So yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind that scaffolding doesn't have to look the same for every student. And just because you might give another student a little bit of extra help in terms of the scaffolding you provide, doesn't mean you have to give that to every student. One more thing about scaffolding that I have definitely learnt in my first few years of teaching is not to overcomplicate it. So like I mentioned before, it can be hard to get scaffolding right, and sometimes you end up over scaffolding and it makes it too easy for students, or you under scaffold and it's too difficult. But sometimes I've found that if I've made my scaffolding too detailed or too in-depth, so maybe a planning sheet, I've written out multiple different questions that the students need to answer for each section or something like that, I've found that when I've provided that much scaffolding, they can actually get really confused about what they're meant to be doing. And so try and keep your scaffolding simple, stick to that color coding if that works for you, or maybe try just scaffolding certain sections of an assignment. So yeah, again, try not to make it too complex as well, because often the students will get a bit confused and everything like that. I hope that I've explained scaffolding well. I think I sort of talked myself in circles a little bit there. But yeah, examples, templates or planning documents, and remember that scaffolding doesn't have to be the same for everyone. So far we've talked about providing options and scaffolding as ways to differentiate, and then the last thing that I'm going to talk about is strategic grouping. And I've sort of only recently started doing this in my class. There's another teacher at school who is an absolute pro at strategic grouping, and so I've learned a lot from him recently. But strategic grouping is all about choosing students to work in a group together in order to complete a task. And you might base the groups on sort of ability, but also on sort of relationships, like who works really well together and that sort of thing. But choosing the groups for students rather than just saying, oh yeah, work with your friends or whatever, I think allows you to strategically get students to work together. So maybe you've got a really high achieving student who you think could really be pushed to achieve even more, and maybe you've got a couple of students like that in your class. So you might choose to put them in a group together because they might feed off each other and create something amazing that you never would have thought of. So that's one way that you can group and make sure that you are stretching students. But then you might also have some students who find a particular activity really challenging. And so maybe when you're doing group work, you might put them together and set them a slightly modified task. And so there's various different ways that you can do strategic grouping. So that's based on, I guess, similar ability, so grouping students of a similar ability together. But then you might also group with mixed ability because maybe you think that some particular students might be able to push other students and help them to achieve a little bit more, or maybe you have a sort of very organized student in each group who can keep the group on track. And so doing that strategic grouping, sitting down, taking the time to arrange the students into groups that you think are going to work really well is another great way to differentiate. And to do that even further, what you can do is within those groups, you can give each student a role. And so I've done this before, both for activities in class, but also with group assignments. And so there's maybe 3 or 4 different roles within each group, depending on the assignment. And then each student gets to choose what role they are in, and they have a very clear outline of what their role is. And so that allows them to focus in on something that they're really good at. So like I said, maybe you have a student who's really organized but has low literacy levels. They can be the group organizer, and so they can manage everyone. Maybe you have a student who's really good at spelling, grammar and punctuation. So maybe they can be the editor or something like that. So giving each student a role within the group as well, I think can work really well, especially allowing the students to choose those roles, because often you'll know in your head which role they're going to pick, but you give them that option to choose as well within their group. So I hope that made sense. Strategic grouping can be really effective, and like I said, I'm only just starting to use it in my classes and experimenting with it a little bit more, but there's various ways that you can do grouping, and then to take it that step further, you can set specific roles within each group as well. So I think that pretty much covers everything that I wanted to talk about in terms of differentiation. I hope this video has helped you to see that differentiation doesn't always mean changing absolutely everything for a student and tripling your workload or anything like that. Sometimes it can just be simple tweaks and changes that allow all students to succeed. I think that that is the whole point of differentiation, to allow students to demonstrate their learning in the best way possible and show what they've learned and how they've developed the skills that you wanted them to. That's where I'm going to leave this video today, but thank you so much for joining me. I will see you all very soon in my next video. Bye!